American Airlines is, by almost any measure size, the biggest airline on the planet. It flies more passengers, operates more scheduled departures, and commands a larger overall network than any other carrier in the world. And yet, year after year, when the big three U.S. legacy carriers report their earnings, American is the one quietly hoping nobody notices how far behind it has fallen. Delta posts record profits. United keeps closing the gap on Delta. American posts a net loss, then calls it progress because the loss was smaller than the year before. This is not a story about an airline that got unlucky. It is a story about an airline that, again and again, made strategic choices that locked in years of underperformance, and is only now beginning to understand why. Start with the most basic measure of financial health: margin. In recent years, Delta has consistently posted double-digit operating margins, often in the range of 9 to 12%, while United has clawed its way into similar territory, sometimes posting pre-tax margins north of 9% in a strong quarter. American, by contrast, has spent quarter after quarter hovering barely above break-even, occasionally slipping into outright net losses even as its revenue numbers look respectable on paper. In one recent third quarter, American's revenue rose only slightly year over year, and it still recorded a net loss, marking a third consecutive year of red ink in that particular quarter, even as its operating income ticked up. Meanwhile, Delta's revenue in that same window came in noticeably higher with a double-digit operating margin, and United wasn't far behind. The pattern is consistent enough that it stops looking like noise and starts looking like a structural problem. So what actually happened? The story really begins with the pandemic, and more specifically, with the bets each airline made about how quickly travel demand would return. When COVID-19 shut down international borders almost overnight, every airline was suddenly sitting on a huge number of wide-body aircraft, the large jets used for long-haul, intercontinental flying, that had no passengers to carry. Each airline had to decide what to do with that excess capacity, and each made a different bet. United largely chose to wait. It parked its wide-body fleet in storage, betting that long-haul demand would eventually return, and that it made more sense to mothball the planes than to give up the capacity entirely. Delta took a more selective approach, retiring its aging fleet of older long-haul aircraft that were closer to the end of their useful life anyway, while preserving the newer core of its wide-body fleet. American took the most aggressive position of the three. Believing that international travel recovery would be slow and uncertain, it permanently retired a huge slice of its long-haul fleet, cutting a meaningful percentage of its wide-body capacity in one move. For a while, that decision looked defensible. Nobody knew how fast people would start flying internationally again. But the recovery, when it came hard and fast, and American had less capacity to capture it. By the time European and transatlantic demand surged back in the summer of 2022, fueled by pent-up travel appetite and passengers willing to pay historically high fares, American simply didn't have enough long-haul aircraft to take full advantage. To make matters worse, Boeing was in the middle of yet another production and quality control crisis, this time involving issues with how sections of the 787 Dreamliner's fuselage were being joined together. Regulators halted deliveries until the problem was fixed, and American, which was counting on a wave of new 787s to help rebuild the long-haul fleet it had cut, didn't get the airplanes it needed in time for the most lucrative travel season in years. The result was painful and visible. American was forced to cut historically profitable routes, trim frequencies on flights to Asia and South America, and reallocate whatever wide-body capacity it had left toward its strongest Atlantic markets just to stay competitive. Meanwhile, transatlantic demand kept climbing for years afterward, with Americans spending dramatically more on international travel than they had before the pandemic. That extra spending didn't go to American in proportion to its size. It disproportionately went to Delta and United, the two carriers that had preserved more of their long-haul capacity through the crisis. Once Boeing resolved the production issues and deliveries resumed, American discovered a second problem buried inside the first one. Not only had it cut too much capacity, it had cut the wrong mix of capacity. By retiring so many of its older aircraft all at once, American ended up with a long-haul fleet overly weighted toward newer, more expensive airplanes. That sounds like a good problem to have, but it isn't, because newer aircraft come with higher monthly lease and finance payments. Those higher payments are usually worth it because newer jets burn less fuel, but only if the airline flies them enough hours per month to actually recoup the savings. Demand for air travel is seasonal, dropping sharply in winter and surging in summer, which limits how many hours any airline can profitably fly its full fleet year-round. With a fleet now skewed too heavily toward costly new aircraft, American found itself paying premium financing costs without always being able to fly those planes enough to offset them. So it did something almost nobody expected from an airline that was already short on long-haul capacity. It deliberately deferred future aircraft deliveries, slowing its own growth rate to correct the imbalance. Today, a noticeably higher share of American's long-haul fleet is made up of newer generation aircraft compared to United or Delta, a legacy of a retirement decision made in a single, chaotic year that the airline is still working to unwind. While all of this was happening with the fleet, American was also struggling geographically, particularly across the Pacific. Asian and Oceania travel demand has never matched the scale of the transatlantic market, but it is still substantial, and American has historically captured less of it than its rivals. Part of the problem is structural. American's West Coast hub sits at Los Angeles International Airport, which on paper looks like a natural gateway to Asia, but in practice is a crowded, inefficient hub because every major U.S. airline operates there. With 3 competitors all running domestic feed into the same airport, none of them can build a kind of deep, sprawling regional network that makes for a truly dominant international gateway. United solved this by building its Pacific strategy primarily around San Francisco, where its domestic network is much larger. Delta solved it by concentrating on Seattle. American, lacking an equivalent secondary West Coast hub with real scale, has simply never found its footing across the Pacific in the same way. It tried, though, and that attempt became one of the more expensive misadventures in the airline's recent history. Coming out of the pandemic, American struck a partnership with Alaska Airlines that would let the 2 carriers coordinate schedules and share revenue, with American using Seattle as a springboard for ambitious new long-haul routes to destinations like Bangalore, London, and Shanghai. Almost none of it worked out. The Bangalore route fell apart after Russia closed its airspace to Western carriers following its invasion of Ukraine, lengthening flight times to South Asia just enough to push the route out of range of the aircraft American planned to use. The Shanghai route got repeatedly delayed by China's prolonged pandemic-era travel restrictions and was eventually shifted to depart from Dallas instead. And not long after, Alaska Airlines announced its own merger with Hawaiian Airlines, gaining a fleet of wide-body aircraft that let it build out its own long-haul ambitions from Seattle, effectively replacing the role American had been trying to play in the partnership. American Seattle expansion was eventually unwound entirely, leaving the airline having spent real time, money, and management attention chasing a strategy that left it no better off across the Pacific than when it started. A similar story played out domestically in Austin, Texas. As Austin's economy boomed in the years following the pandemic, fueled by a wave of relocating tech workers and remote employees drawn to its lower cost of living, American saw an opportunity to claim the city before its rivals did. It rapidly expanded its route network out of Austin, growing the number of destinations it served from the airport several times over in just a couple of years. Part of the logic was defensive. Austin's airport allocates gate access based on usage, and by flying enough departures, American could lock up gate capacity and box out Delta, which had quietly designated Austin a focus city of its own just before the pandemic. The problem was that actual passenger demand never caught up to the ambition. American leaned on smaller regional jets to fill the schedule, which ran into contractual limits with its pilots' union restricting how many non-hub flights could be operated with regional aircraft instead of mainline planes. By the time Austin's population growth began cooling off as housing costs caught up with its reputation as an affordable boomtown, American was left with a route network the local market simply couldn't support, and it had to scale much of it back. Then there was the Northeast. American has long been the weakest of the big 3 in New York, hemmed in by limited gate and slot availability at JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark. Rather than try to outgrow that constraint, American partnered with JetBlue in what became known as the Northeast Alliance, an agreement to coordinate schedules, share revenue, and essentially combine forces to compete more effectively against Delta and United in the region. In practice, That meant American handing off certain domestic routes to JetBlue in exchange for reallocating its own aircraft toward new long-haul international flights from New York. The airlines argued the partnership made both of them stronger competitors against the two bigger carriers. The Department of Justice disagreed, suing on antitrust grounds, and a federal judge ultimately ordered the partnership dissolve, ruling that strengthening one rival at the expense of broader competition wasn't a valid offense under antitrust law. The networks reverted close to where they'd started. Once again, American had invested years of strategic focus and operational complexity into an initiative that produced essentially nothing once it was unwound. Perhaps the most damaging self-inflicted wound, though, came from corporate sales. Even as leisure travel boomed post-pandemic, corporate travel, typically booked through travel management companies and agencies on behalf of business travelers, remained a critical, high-margin segment of airline revenue. American decided it wanted a bigger cut of that business and a more direct relationship with corporate customers. So it launched an aggressive campaign to push travel agencies away from the older, established booking systems they relied on and onto American's newer, more modern distribution technology. To force the issue, American pulled a significant share of its cheapest fares out of the old booking system entirely, making them available only through the new technology, and stripped frequent flyer mileage earnings from bookings made the old way. The bet was that corporate customers and their travel agencies would have no choice but to adapt. Instead, large numbers of agencies and corporate accounts simply stopped booking American as much, shifting that business to Delta and United instead, which made no such demands. American eventually reversed the policy, but not before the misstep was estimated to have cost the airline well over $1 billion in lost revenue in a single year, along with longer-term damage to corporate relationships that has taken years to repair. Meanwhile, while management's attention was consumed by Seattle, Austin, the Northeast Alliance, and the corporate sales fight, American's hub in Chicago was quietly losing ground. The airline pulled back capacity there relative to pre-pandemic levels, while United held steady or grew. And because Chicago's airport allocates gates partly based on usage, American ended up losing valuable gate space to United as a result, a loss it fought in court and ultimately lost. To be fair, American hasn't been standing still in its response. The executive most associated with the aggressive corporate sales strategy departed the company, and American has spent the years since rebuilding relationships with travel agencies and corporate accounts. New 787 deliveries have continued to arrive, and American has redesigned its wide-body cabins to include significantly more lie-flat business class seating, addressing a long-standing gap, where its planes carried noticeably fewer premium seats than comparable United aircraft. It has also begun introducing the Airbus A321XLR, a long-range narrow-body aircraft that can profitably serve lower-demand European destinations that don't justify a full wide-body jet, filling a gap left by the retirement of its 757 fleet years earlier. But even with those fixes underway, American is, at best, working its way back to where it already stood before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, it was already the weakest of the big three financially. The deeper issue isn't any single bad decision. It's a pattern, a series of high-stakes strategic bets made under pressure and uncertainty that consistently turn out wrong, compounding instead of canceling each other out. Other airlines made mistakes during the same period too. But American's mistakes kept landing in the same direction at the same time, reinforcing rather than offsetting one another. The bigger question now is whether American's recent course corrections are enough to actually close the gap, or whether the airline is simply repairing the damage from its own missteps, while Delta and United continue extending their lead. Either way, the lesson from the last several years is clear. In an industry built on enormous fixed costs, long planning horizons, and decisions that take years to reverse, getting the big strategic calls wrong doesn't just cost an airline a bad quarter. It can cost it years of ground that may never fully be recovered.